On a warm July afternoon in rural Indiana, the Carter family walked through the gates of the Willow County Fair with the kind of excitement that only comes once a year. The fair had been running for decades, drawing families from every surrounding town. You could hear the music long before you saw the carnival lights, old country songs drifting over the sound of laughter, livestock, and the mechanical churn of rides that had been assembled just 2 days earlier. For 7-year-old Evan Carter, this place was magic. He'd been counting the days all summer, circling the date on the family calendar in blue marker, reminding his parents every morning how many sleeps were left until the fair returned. Evan was the kind of kid people remembered small for his age, with messy blonde hair that never stayed flat, and a habit of talking to animals as if they understood every word. He clutched a stick of cotton candy in one hand, and with the other, he tugged on his older sister Hannah's arm, urging her toward the petting zoo. She teased him for acting like he'd never seen a goat before, but she followed anyway, because seeing him smile like that was worth it. The petting zoo was crowded, packed with families and young children pushing against the wooden rails to pet lambs, calves, and rabbits. Evan fit right into the chaos. His parents stood a short distance away, talking about whether to get lemonade before or after the kids finished. Nothing about that moment felt unusual. Nothing suggested they were seconds away from the moment that would change their lives forever. Evan fed a goat, dropped a few pieces of hay, laughed when the animal nudged his hand for more, and then he looked back at his sister just to make sure she was still there. Hannah nodded, smiling. She turned her head for a moment to answer something her mom said, a quick exchange about where to meet after the petting zoo. When she looked back toward her brother, he wasn't there. At first, she assumed he'd just moved to another pen. Kids wandered in circles all the time. She called his name, expecting him to bounce back into view. But he didn't. She took a step forward, weaving through the crowd, calling again. Her voice got a little sharper. No one answered. The goats kept chewing, the parents kept laughing, the fair music kept playing, and yet something around her felt wrong. She looked back toward her parents, confusion starting to spread across her face. By the time she reached them, panic had already taken root in her voice. "Mom, I don't see Evan." At first, they thought she was joking or overreacting. His mom looked around the enclosure, expecting to see a small blonde head pop up from behind someone's legs. His dad walked a quick loop around the inside of the pen, scanning the area. Nothing. They widened the circle. Still nothing. A few minutes passed, just enough for the tightness in their chests to become something sharper, heavier, harder to explain away. Within 10 minutes, they were running. Fair staff radioed each other, scanning the nearby booths, asking vendors to keep an eye out for a little boy in a red striped shirt. People stepped aside as the Carters rushed through crowds, shouting Evan's name louder and louder. By the 15-minute mark, someone called the sheriff's department. A missing child report was broadcast through every deputy's radio in the county. Officers already on site began searching the fairgrounds with the urgency of people who understood exactly how quickly a child could vanish in a place that crowded. The Willow County Fair had nearly 3,000 people inside its fences that day. Families moved shoulder to shoulder between game stalls and food trucks. Teenagers waited in lines for rides. Vendors yelled over the noise to attract customers. And somewhere in that dense, shifting sea of bodies, Evan was gone. Not just misplaced, not just hiding, but gone in a way that didn't make sense. Deputies ordered the gates to be closed. No cars were allowed out. Fairgoers were told it was a minor emergency, that a child was missing, and everyone needed to stay calm. Some people obeyed without question. Others grew impatient, insisting they had somewhere to be. A few just looked confused. But the reason for the lockdown became clear as officers began checking every restroom, every booth, every trailer behind the food stands. Evan wasn't in any of them. His parents followed officers through the grounds, answering questions through tears. What was he wearing? Did he have pockets? Could he have walked off on his own? Had he ever done something like this before? They answered everything with the same urgency, the same disbelief. Evan wasn't a wanderer. He wasn't the type to slip away. And even if he had tried, someone should have seen him. But no one had. As the search expanded, so did the fear. People who had seen nothing earlier began to replay the day in their minds, trying to remember if they'd passed a crying child or noticed a kid walking alone. Rumors spread fast. Someone claimed to have heard a scream, though no one else could confirm it. Someone else said a boy matching Evan's description had been seen near the Ferris wheel. When deputies checked the area, the operator insisted he hadn't seen anyone leave the line unexpectedly. The more people talked, the more confusing everything became. By the 2-hour mark, the fairgrounds were unrecognizable. Officers moved through the crowds with purpose, volunteers lined up for search instructions, and the Carter family stood near the command post in a kind of silent shock that made everything around them blur. Evan's name echoed through the loudspeakers. Hannah kept insisting she only looked away for a second. Her father kept shaking his head, trying to replay the moment, trying to find something he'd missed. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the dusty fairground paths, deputies widened the perimeter again. They began checking under bleachers, behind generators, inside livestock trailers, anywhere a small child could hide or be hidden. A team of officers spread out in a grid across the nearby field, walking slowly, scanning the ground for footprints. The only tracks they found belonged to adults, vendors, and livestock. Not a single small footprint led away from the petting zoo. That detail bothered investigators. If Evan had walked off on his own, the dirt paths should have picked up something, an imprint, a scuff, anything indicating direction. Instead, it was as if he'd vanished without touching the ground. As dusk turned to a heavy purple-blue, flashlights lit the fairgrounds like clusters of fireflies. Deputies returned to early eyewitnesses, asking them to go over their accounts again. Most repeated what they'd said earlier. They hadn't seen anything unusual. But one vendor paused before answering. He ran a fried dough stand near the main walkway and remembered something he hadn't thought was worth mentioning earlier. He told deputies he'd seen a man in a faded denim jacket moving quickly through the crowd. The man wasn't running, but he wasn't strolling either. His head was down, and he seemed to be cutting through people with purpose. What made the vendor notice him was the way he held a child's wrist firm, too firm, dragging more than guiding. The vendor assumed it was just a frustrated parent dealing with a cranky kid. It didn't occur to him to look at the child's face. When officers pressed him, he admitted something else. The child wasn't struggling, but he wasn't walking naturally either. He was being pulled. Deputies immediately swept the parking lot again. They checked every vehicle within a quarter-mile of that walkway. Some cars were locked and untouched. Others belonged to families who were still waiting for the lockdown to lift. A few owners grew irritated when officers asked to open their trunks, but they complied. Nothing suspicious turned up. Still, the detail about the denim jacket changed everything. It was the first concrete lead of the night, and it pointed to a possibility no one wanted to accept. Kidnapping. Deputies interviewed more people, showing a rough sketch of the jacket described by the vendor. A grandmother selling knitted toys remembered seeing someone similar heading toward the west exit, near the gravel lot. A teenage couple recalled being bumped by a man who kept glancing over his shoulder. Neither remembered seeing a child. The stories didn't line up perfectly. Times conflicted. Directions shifted. But they all described the same jacket. As midnight approached, the fairgrounds finally began to empty under controlled release. Families left with their children held close, their expressions filled with fear and sympathy. Officers promised the Carters they would search through the night. Volunteers offered to return at first light. A command post was left, standing even after the loudspeakers went silent. But Evan didn't appear. And as the final officers walked the grounds with their flashlights sweeping across empty stalls, one thing settled heavily over everyone involved: whatever happened to Evan Carter. It didn't look like something that would resolve easily. He hadn't wandered off, he hadn't gotten lost, and he hadn't simply blended into the crowd. Someone took him. And the only clue anyone had was a fading memory of a denim jacket disappearing into the noise of a crowded county fair. By dawn, the Willow County Fairgrounds no longer looked like a place of joy. The smell of fried food and hay still hung in the air, but the laughter, the music, and the color were gone. Floodlights cast harsh circles over trampled grass as deputies marked off grids with fluorescent tape. Dozens of volunteers arrived before sunrise, some still in pajamas, holding flashlights and coffee. They weren't just searching for a missing boy, they were searching for their own sense of safety. The sheriff's department took control quickly, establishing a command center near the livestock barn. From there, every resource the county could spare was redirected to one mission: find 7-year-old Evan Carter. By mid-morning, state police had arrived, along with a team of search and rescue dogs trained to track human scent. The air was heavy, the kind that sticks to your lungs, and each hour that passed without a lead made it harder to breathe. The dogs began where Evan was last seen, near the petting zoo. Their handlers moved slowly, giving them room to work. Within minutes, one of the bloodhounds caught a scent and pulled hard toward the main walkway. Hope flickered across everyone's faces. The dog led them past the lemonade stand, around a corner near the Ferris wheel, and toward the west parking lot, the same direction that vendor had mentioned the night before. But then, just as suddenly, the trail stopped. The animal circled twice, whining, confused. It was as if Evan's scent had evaporated into the gravel. Officers scoured the area on their hands and knees, sifting through dust and debris. That's when one deputy spotted it, a faint imprint in the dirt, smaller than the rest. A child's shoe print, pressed halfway into the soil near the fence line. They marked it, photographed it, measured it. It was a match for the sneakers Evan had been wearing, but it ended abruptly, with no other prints leading away. The find changed the tone of the search. This wasn't a boy lost in the maze of rides or hiding under a bench. This was something else, something intentional. By noon, the fairgrounds were closed entirely. Helicopters hovered low, using infrared to scan the open fields beyond the property. Officers checked every vehicle still parked nearby, even those belonging to fair workers. In town, roadblocks went up along every highway exit, and local radio stations broadcast Evan's description every 15 minutes. The community mobilized in a way no one could remember seeing before. People drove from neighboring counties to help. Churches opened kitchens to feed the searchers. Farmers brought ATVs to comb through cornfields stretching miles beyond the fair. But even with all that manpower, there was nothing. By the second day, fatigue set in. The sun rose on blistered faces and red eyes. Volunteers trudged through muddy ditches, calling Evan's name into the silence. Deputies checked drainage pipes, wells, and barns left over from the fair's livestock exhibits. Each new area they cleared only deepened the dread that was settling over Willow County. Back at the command post, detectives started interviewing vendors one by one. Most remembered seeing Evan at some point that afternoon, but their statements didn't line up. The man who ran the lemonade stand swore he saw him near the midway around 2:30 p.m., holding a stuffed bear he'd just won. A woman from the popcorn booth said she spotted him closer to 3:15 near the livestock gate alone, looking lost. But a teenage ride operator placed him much later, around 4 p.m., watching the bumper cars from behind the fence, eating cotton candy. 3 sightings, 3 times, 3 completely different parts of the fairgrounds. Detectives pinned each statement to a large aerial map of the property. When they drew lines connecting the supposed locations, a pattern emerged. The sightings formed a slow, deliberate path from the petting zoo toward the western edge of the fairgrounds, the same area where the shoe print was found. The implication was terrifying. If all 3 witnesses were telling the truth, Evan hadn't vanished instantly. He had been moved, led, or carried through the fair across nearly an hour, slipping unnoticed through thousands of people, hidden in plain sight. The sheriff called for a press briefing that afternoon. Cameras captured the exhausted faces of search leaders as they asked anyone who had been at the fair to come forward with photos or videos. "Even if you think it's nothing," the sheriff said, "we need to see it." Within hours, hundreds of images poured in, families posing near the Ferris wheel, kids eating corn dogs, teens laughing by the games. Investigators went frame by frame, scanning the backgrounds for a glimpse of a small blonde boy or a man in a denim jacket. They found nothing conclusive. That night, storm clouds rolled in, threatening to wash away what little evidence remained. Deputies worked through the rain anyway, covering search dogs with ponchos and remarking their grid lines with glow sticks. In a nearby field, one officer thought he heard something faint like a cry carried on the wind, but when they converged on the spot, it was only the creak of a rusted gate blowing open and shut. By the 3rd day, hope began to crack. The once crowded volunteer lines had thinned. The Carters were kept inside a mobile command trailer for privacy, surrounded by family and counselors, though nothing could dull the hollow look in their eyes. The fairgrounds, once alive with light, now felt haunted, rides dismantled, booths empty, the smell of rain and diesel hanging in the air. Investigators reviewed the timeline again, desperate for something they'd missed. Every path circled back to that gravel lot. Every scent trail, every witness account, every instinct pointed there, and then stopped cold. It was the kind of dead end that made even seasoned detectives uneasy. Late that evening, the sheriff's lead investigator, tired and drenched from the storm, stared at the map and said quietly to no one in particular, "He didn't walk out of here. Somebody carried him." The words lingered in the tent long after the rain stopped. When the search officially transitioned from rescue to recovery, no one wanted to say it aloud. The volunteers went home. The floodlights shut off. What remained was silence, a silence that wrapped around the fairgrounds like fog, as if the land itself was holding its breath. And just beyond the fence line, half buried in gravel and dust, the single partial shoe print waited, the only sign that a 7-year-old boy had ever been there at all. It would be years before anyone knew how close they had come. In the weeks that followed, the noise around the case began to fade, but the silence that replaced it was somehow louder. The first 48 hours had felt like a living nightmare, the endless search parties, the floodlights sweeping empty fields, the sound of radios crackling with false hope. But when the fairgrounds were finally cleared, and the news crews packed up their vans, the Carters were left standing in a house that didn't feel like home anymore. Evan's room remained untouched. His school backpack still hung by the door. His shoes, the other pair, not the one the police had found in the gravel, sat by his bed, waiting for feet that would never return. At first, the sheriff's office tried to keep the momentum alive. Every few days, a new lead surfaced. Someone claimed they saw a boy who looked like Evan at a gas station in southern Indiana, sitting in the back of a faded red sedan. A clerk swore she recognized his photo from the flyers, but the security footage was too grainy, the timestamp too late. By the time police reached the location, the car was gone. A week later, a truck driver reported seeing a crying child on the shoulder of Interstate 74, barefoot, wearing what he thought was a red striped shirt. He slowed down but didn't stop, assuming help was already on the way. When he heard the news about Evan later that night, guilt drove him straight to the nearest state trooper barracks. Officers spent 2 days reviewing surveillance footage from every highway camera within 30 miles. Nothing matched. The driver's timeline had been off by nearly an hour. Each new tip brought a brief surge of hope, followed by the same crushing emptiness when it led nowhere. Volunteers still put up flyers, even as the corners began to curl from the weather. The posters hung on telephone poles, store windows, rest stop bathrooms, Evan's small face staring back at strangers who no longer recognized his name. Rumors began to fill the space where facts ran out. Some said he'd been taken by someone in the carnival, a drifter, maybe, who moved with the fairs from town to town. Others believed he'd been sold, trafficked, hidden somewhere across state lines. The sheriff's department tried to stamp out speculation, but in a small town, whispers have a way of spreading faster than truth. Inside the Carter home, the grief turned inward. Evan's father, Mark, spent most of his days in the garage, tinkering with his tools, saying very little. He stopped going to work for a while, then returned only because the bills didn't stop coming. People described him as quiet before the tragedy, but now he was silent in a way that unnerved even those closest to him. His wife, Laura, went the other direction. She couldn't stop. She called every detective, every state office, every child advocacy group that might listen. She built binders full of leads, newspaper clippings, timelines, and maps. Every page was highlighted, cross-referenced, and dated. It became her new religion, finding her son, or at least the truth about what happened to him. Their daughter, Hannah, carried her own kind of burden. She was only 11 when Evan disappeared, old enough to understand blame and young enough to take it all personally. She replayed the day over and over, that single moment she'd looked away. Sometimes she confessed to her mother that she could still feel his hand in hers, and then the sudden emptiness when it was gone. Laura told her it wasn't her fault, but words like that never reach where the guilt lives. The investigators felt it too, a quiet frustration that built behind closed doors. They'd interviewed everyone they could, run down every tip, searched the surrounding counties more than once. Without new evidence, the case began to cool. There was no ransom note, no confirmed abduction vehicle, no proof that Evan had ever left the fairgrounds alive. By autumn, The search effort had dwindled to a handful of volunteers and a few detectives who refused to give up. Local media moved on. News stories took over the headlines. The county fairgrounds reopened months later under stricter security, but attendance dropped nearly in half. Families whispered about the missing boy without using his name, as if saying it aloud might bring the darkness back. The Carters tried to survive in their own ways. Holidays came and went. Christmas was unbearable. Evan's unopened gifts stayed under the tree until February. Laura couldn't bring herself to pack them away. She began writing letters to Evan, hundreds of them, stacking them neatly in a shoebox under her bed, in case he comes home, she said. 1 year passed. On the anniversary of his disappearance, the town held a small vigil at the fairgrounds. Maybe 50 people showed up, holding candles that flickered in the evening wind. The sheriff gave a short speech about perseverance, about how they were still following up on leads. But even his voice carried the weight of exhaustion. Hannah stood beside her mother, staring at the empty pen where the petting zoo had once been. The laughter that used to echo there had long been replaced by silence. That night, Laura returned home and opened her binders again. She noticed patterns no one else had mentioned: the carnival workers who'd packed up early, the maintenance man who hadn't checked in after the fair closed, a phone number scribbled wrong on one of the witness forms. She called the sheriff the next morning, but he told her they'd already followed those leads. She called again the week after. Eventually, the calls stopped being returned. The investigation was still open, technically, but to everyone involved, it had become what officers quietly call a file case. No new evidence, no movement, no answers. The binders went back on the shelf. The flyers faded. Life moved on, at least for everyone else. But for the Carters, time didn't move forward, it just stretched. Each day without Evan became a reminder that he could still be out there somewhere, that maybe someone, somewhere, knew the truth. And yet, as the seasons changed and the world forgot, something stayed buried in that town, something waiting to be unearthed years later, when a discovery in the dirt would bring the case back to life. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research and countless hours of digging for the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering these mysteries, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Now, let's get back to the case. 17 years passed before anyone spoke Evan Carter's name in the present tense again. By then, the fairgrounds had changed hands, the old rides replaced with new ones, and most of the people who'd lived through that summer had quietly filed the memory away. Life had continued, but in Willow County, the absence never really left. It just became something people avoided. Then one gray morning, a construction crew working several miles west of town unearthed something small that shouldn't have been there. They were clearing farmland for a housing development, grading soil that hadn't been touched in decades. The foreman spotted it, first half buried in packed earth, wedged between two tree roots. At first, he thought it was trash, an old shoe discarded long ago. But when one of the workers brushed away the dirt, the size stopped them. It wasn't an adult's. It was tiny, weathered, and cracked, the kind of sneaker a child might have worn. Protocol required them to report any possible human remains or personal effects. Within hours, deputies from the county sheriff's office arrived. They carefully removed the shoe, placed it in a clear evidence bag, and marked the coordinates. It was scuffed, faded to a dull gray, but a small cartoon rocket stitched along the side was still visible. That detail alone made one detective pause. Evan Carter's missing person flyer, archived, yellowed, and buried in a file room, had described his sneakers exactly that way. The item was sent to the state lab for DNA testing. The results came back in less than a week. The soil had preserved enough material for confirmation. The DNA on the inner lining matched Laura Carter's. The shoe belonged to Evan. The news reached the Carter family on a quiet Tuesday morning. After 17 years of silence, the sheriff himself drove to their home. For Laura, it wasn't relief, it was collapse. The shoe meant proof, but not answers. It meant her son had been there, miles away from anywhere they had searched, and far from the fairgrounds where he was last seen. Within 24 hours, the case was reopened. New detectives joined the investigation, bringing modern forensics and technology the original team had never had. They pulled out every box from storage witness statements, Maps, photographs, audio tapes from interviews conducted decades earlier. Many of the old leads had gone cold, but the new evidence forced everyone to look again. The discovery site was unusual. The farmland had once belonged to an older couple who died years before Evan disappeared. After that, it had sat vacant, no structures, no paths, no activity. But through aerial photos and property records, investigators discovered something strange. Behind the fields, barely visible through overgrowth, was an old service road that once connected to another property deeper in the woods. That property, according to county records, had been owned by a man named Raymond Holt. Holt wasn't a name from the original suspect list. He'd been a local handyman, known for taking odd jobs, roof repairs, painting barns, fixing fences. He lived alone on the edge of the county in a weathered farmhouse that had fallen into disrepair. Records showed he'd been arrested twice, once for trespassing, another time for unlawful restraint after a dispute with a tenant he'd allegedly locked in a shed overnight. He was never charged with anything serious, but the incidents painted a pattern of behavior that made investigators uneasy. Holt had died in 2013, leaving behind no family and no estate worth mentioning. His farmhouse had sat abandoned ever since. When detectives reviewed the geography, it became clear his property sat less than a mile from where Evan's shoe was found. The new team began reconstructing the timeline from 2008 backward. They revisited the idea that Evan might have been moved deliberately through the Fairgrounds, hidden in plain sight. Back then, it had seemed impossible, too coordinated, too bold. But now, with the shoe found so far from the original search grid, that theory didn't sound so far-fetched. If Holt had access to the service road behind the fairgrounds, it could have provided a hidden exit, one that bypassed the parking lot and all the checkpoints that had been locked down that night. Detectives interviewed people who had known Holt. Neighbors described him as quiet but strange. He kept to himself, rarely left his property, and was known to burn trash late at night. One woman recalled that during the summer Evan went missing, Holt's truck had been seen driving into town more often than usual. Another remembered hearing about a young boy visiting the property, though she couldn't remember where she'd heard it. The sheriff's office began digging through old work orders from the fairgrounds that year. It turned out Holt had been hired as a temporary maintenance worker for the setup crew, paid in cash. No formal record beyond a first name written on a contractor log. He would have had full access to restricted areas, including service gates and delivery roads. That discovery shifted the case from speculation to something far darker. Forensic teams were deployed to Holt's former property. Even after nearly 2 decades, crime scene analysts believed the soil and materials inside the house could still hold trace evidence: fibers, hair, or residue. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and though most of the property was overgrown, they reacted near a collapsed storage shed and an old well filled with debris. Investigators marked the area for excavation. Inside the farmhouse, time had stopped. Furniture sat covered in dust, wallpaper peeled from the walls, and a faint smell of decay lingered beneath the mold. In one room, they found old newspapers stacked waist-high, with dates ranging from 2006 to 2010. Beneath the pile, an old Polaroid camera. They logged everything. As word spread, the media reignited the story that had long been buried. Headlines across the state read, "New break in 17-year-old missing boy case." For the Carter family, it felt like reopening a wound that had never healed. Hannah, now in her 20s, drove home for the first time in years. Her mother refused to speak to reporters. Mark sat in silence during the press conference, his eyes fixed on the ground. For investigators, the focus now was simple: find a connection between Holt and the night of the fair. One surviving member of the original search team told them something that had always bothered him. A pickup truck seen parked along a gravel road west of the fairgrounds, spotted briefly by a volunteer hours after the lockdown. No one had checked it because it wasn't inside the search perimeter. That road, now known to have led toward Holt's land, had been dismissed as irrelevant. 17 years later, that single oversight had become the center of the investigation. Detectives couldn't say for certain what happened yet, but the pieces were aligning into a chilling possibility. Evan hadn't simply vanished. He had been taken, hidden, and moved through paths no one had searched. And now, after all these years, the land itself was beginning to give him back. What they found inside that farmhouse in the days that followed would confirm just how close the truth had been all along, and how one man's quiet life on the edge of town had concealed something far more sinister. The farmhouse stood deep within the trees, its walls gray and caved inward from years of neglect. When the forensic team arrived, silence hung heavy in the air, thick, unmoving, almost aware. The front steps gave under their boots, the floor inside bowed with age, and cobwebs framed the doorways like curtains. It had been 12 years since anyone had set foot inside, and yet, somehow, it felt like someone had never left. They began the slow, methodical process of clearing each room. Dust lifted with every movement, catching the light that crept through broken windows. The living room was barren except for a torn sofa and a rusted lamp. In the kitchen, jars of nails and screws sat neatly labeled along the counter, each one coated in grime. It was the kind of obsessive organization that made sense only to someone who'd spent a lot of time alone. In the corner of what might have been a bedroom, one of the investigators noticed something off the boards underfoot sounded different. Hollow. They pried them open, one nail at a time, revealing a small metal tin wedged between the beams. Inside were objects that didn't belong in a house like this. The first was a small green plastic dinosaur, its tail chipped and faded but unmistakably a child's toy. The second was a torn paper wristband from the Willow County Fair, the ink nearly erased by time but still faintly legible. And then, at the bottom, a single, Polaroid photograph. The photo showed a young boy sitting on a wooden chair in what appeared to be the same farmhouse. His eyes were swollen, his face streaked with tears. The frame cut off just below the chin, obscuring most of his face, but his clothes were clear. A red striped shirt, denim shorts, and sneakers with small rockets stitched along the sides. The same outfit Evan Carter had been wearing the day he vanished. The room fell quiet. No one said anything for several seconds. The photo wasn't just evidence, it was a window into a truth that had been buried for nearly 2 decades. The investigators bagged the items carefully and began documenting everything. Forensic photographers captured every inch of the discovery, every scratch, every piece of dust. As the day went on, they searched the rest of the house. In a back room, they found old notebooks filled with names, dates, and phone numbers, lists of small towns across Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. Most of them matched the routes of traveling carnivals and county fairs from the early 2000s. Some had check marks beside them, others were crossed out. Detectives reconstructed Holt's timeline using whatever they could find. Through vendor logs from 2008, they confirmed that he had worked the Willow County Fair that year as a maintenance hand. His time card placed him on site for 4 days before the disappearance. A vendor's old credit slip showed a purchase for 2 lemonades at a stand near the petting zoo, time-stamped minutes before Evan vanished. That single receipt connected Holt to the scene in a way that no one had seen before. It meant that while hundreds of officers searched for Evan across open fields, the man responsible had been right there in front of them, blending in with the crowd. Investigators began digging into Holt's work history. He had no stable employment record, just scattered cash jobs through traveling fairs and carnivals stretching across multiple states. The pattern was chilling. Every summer, his name appeared somewhere new, always following the same circuit of small-town fairs. With that came unconfirmed reports of other missing children, isolated incidents that never drew enough attention to connect. Forensic analysts compared fingerprints from the tin with the few on record from Holt's prior arrests. They matched. The box had been hidden by his own hands. But the items inside Evan's wristband, his toy, and that Polaroid told a story no one wanted to hear. The more investigators learned about Holt, the darker his past became. Former coworkers described him as polite but strange, someone who talked to himself, someone who didn't like being touched. He often worked overnight shifts, fixing rides or patching tents. One man remembered Holt insisting he needed to check the maintenance sheds alone. At the time, no one thought much of it. But the question remained. If Holt had taken Evan, where had he gone afterward? Detectives searched the surrounding property for signs of a burial site. Ground-penetrating radar revealed disturbed soil behind the farmhouse, but excavation turned up only animal bones and discarded metal. There were no human remains. The well was dredged, sifted, and examined. Nothing. The ravine nearby offered no clues. It was as if the boy had been here once, briefly, and then vanished again. The investigative team turned to behavioral experts for answers. They speculated that Holt's reclusive nature fit the profile of someone who might have acted on impulse, someone who saw an opportunity and acted quickly. His history of short-term jobs and isolation reinforced the theory. He had both the access and the means to take a child from a crowded fair without drawing attention. But Holt had died in 2013, taking with him whatever truth he knew. His death certificate listed a heart attack, no next of kin, no possessions of value. The farmhouse had sat untouched ever since. As the forensic work wrapped up, the lead investigator stood in the doorway of that decaying house, staring at the sunlight bleeding through the trees outside. The answers they had found raised more questions than they solved. The Polaroid proved Evan had been there. The wristband proved Holt had been at the fair. But there was still no sign of what had happened after. The team left the property with more evidence than they'd ever had before, yet none of it brought closure. For the Carter family, it meant reopening wounds they'd tried to live with. For law enforcement, it meant staring into the possibility that a man who had long been forgotten had orchestrated something far more calculated than anyone believed. And as investigators prepared to search the woods surrounding Holt's land one final time, they couldn't escape the feeling that the ground itself was holding back the last piece of the story, that somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, the answer to what happened to Evan Carter was still waiting to be found. The woods behind Holt's property stretched farther than anyone realized. When investigators returned weeks later to search the surrounding land one final time, they brought with them the weight of nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions. The discovery inside the farmhouse had changed everything. It had proven Evan had been there, but it hadn't told them what had happened after. Somewhere beyond the decaying house, they believed the truth was waiting. The search began early in the morning. Fog clung to the low ground, soft and heavy, swallowing sound. Teams of investigators, forensic specialists, and cadaver dogs moved carefully through the dense brush, marking off sections of the property. What used to be farmland had become wilderness trees reclaiming the open ground, vines twisting over old fence posts. For hours, there was nothing. Just mud, silence, and the crunch of boots on dead leaves. Then, one of the handlers noticed a faint depression in the spruce undergrowth, a narrow, overgrown path leading downhill toward a ravine. The trail was barely visible, swallowed by years of growth, but the shape of it was deliberate. It had once been used often, worn into the soil by tires or footsteps. They followed it slowly, methodically, the dogs sniffing the ground ahead. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest seemed to become. About 200 yards in, one of the dogs stopped. Its nose went to the ground, body tense, tail stiff. The handler called it in. Another dog reacted a few seconds later, in the same spot. The team began clearing brush and marking the location with orange flags. Beneath a thick layer of leaves, one of the searchers spotted something pale and irregular breaking through the soil. It wasn't bone at first glance, just a fragment of something white and weathered. But when they brushed away the dirt, the shape became clear. A small human rib. Nearby, another piece of bone. And another. The excavation took hours. Forensic anthropologists were called in to assist. They worked carefully, inch by inch, documenting every find, mapping the scatter of remains across a 20-foot radius. By dusk, they had uncovered enough to know what they were looking at: a partial human skeleton, small in stature. The next day, dental records confirmed what everyone already feared. The remains belonged to Evan Carter. The news hit Willow County like a cold wind. 17 years of waiting had ended in a single sentence. He's been found. But the details, when they came, were even harder to hear. The forensic report painted a haunting picture. Based on decomposition, bone positioning, and trace evidence, Evan had likely survived for several hours after being taken, possibly even overnight. There were no signs of blunt trauma, no fractures, no defensive wounds. What the evidence did show was exposure, hypothermia, dehydration, and exhaustion. The small boy had been left in the woods, injured and alone, and had succumbed before dawn. Nearby, searchers found remnants of fabric consistent with a child's shirt, faded red stripes still faintly visible. The soil near the remains also contained fibers matching Holt's work clothing. Investigators concluded that Holt had tried to move Evan, possibly to hide him when the police lockdown intensified, but had panicked halfway through. The boy had likely been alive when he was abandoned in the ravine. The recovered shoe that reignited the case had come off during that desperate attempt. The sheriff's office released a public statement explaining that the case had been officially closed. The findings ruled Evan's death as a homicide, by abduction, and neglect. Holt could no longer face justice. He had been dead for 12 years. The closure, though official, brought no peace. For the Carter family, it felt like grief restarting from the beginning. Laura Carter didn't speak publicly for weeks. When she finally did, her voice was calm, almost detached. She said she didn't feel anger anymore, just an emptiness where the hope used to live. For 17 years, she had imagined her son trapped somewhere, alive, waiting. The idea that he had been within a few miles of home the entire time was unbearable. Hannah, now grown with children of her own, returned to Willow County that summer. She hadn't been back since she left for college, trying to escape the shadow of her brother's disappearance. When she stood on the edge of the old fairgrounds, the world around her looked smaller. The petting zoo was gone, the games replaced with new attractions, but the sound of music and laughter still drifted through the air. She walked to the spot where she'd last seen him, where she'd let go of his hand. The guilt that had followed her through every year of her life resurfaced like it had never left. She placed a small flower there and stayed until dusk, listening to the hum of the rides and the distant echo of children, laughing sounds that no longer brought joy, only ghosts. The documentary would later describe how the investigation had come full circle, how a lost shoe had led detectives to a farmhouse forgotten by time, and then to a ravine hidden behind it. How one man's routine job at a county fair had given him access to hundreds of families who never imagined danger could hide in plain sight. And how a single object, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, had broken a silence 17 years long. The forensic team later reconstructed a likely sequence of events. Holt had been at the fair working maintenance on the rides. He had seen Evan near the petting zoo, distracted, momentarily separated from his sister. He acted quickly, guiding him away before anyone noticed. He'd used one of the rear service roads, avoiding the main gates entirely. When the lockdown began, panic set in. The searchlights, the helicopters, the dogs. Holt knew he couldn't get far. So he took the boy into the woods behind his property, trying to wait out the chaos. But something went wrong. Whether Evan ran, cried, or simply became too much to control, Holt abandoned him there. Investigators believed he returned days later, perhaps intending to move the body, but couldn't bring himself to. Instead, he buried what little he could and left the rest to time. For years, storms, roots, and decay had hidden what he'd done. The shoe, dislodged by erosion, had surfaced just enough to be found by chance. The final report was clinical, written in measured language, but beneath the data, the truth was devastating. Evan Carter hadn't been murdered in violence or rage. He had been taken by a man who didn't know what to do once he had him. And in the end, it was neglect, fear, and cowardice that killed him. The closing moments of the story return to Hannah standing alone at the fairgrounds, long after the lights have dimmed. She looks out over the empty paths, the same dirt where footprints once disappeared into nothing. The fair is quieter now, smaller crowds, stricter rules, but every summer, the same date comes and goes. She says she doesn't come to mourn anymore. She comes because it's the last place her brother was happy. For a moment, the wind carries the faintest sound of children laughing somewhere beyond the rides. She closes her eyes and lets it pass. Because for the first time in 17 years, the mystery isn't about where he went. It's about finally knowing he's home. And as the story ends, the narrator's voice lingers on one final thought, that after all the theories, the sightings, the years of silence, it wasn't an eyewitness or a confession that solved it. It was something far smaller, forgotten, and buried. One lost shoe that refused to stay hidden.